Princess Isabel of Navarre was 12 years old when they dressed her in white silk for her wedding day. The gown weighed more than she did. Court seamstresses had worked for 6 months creating a dress fit for the most important political marriage in a generation, never once considering whether a child's frame could actually support it. The marriage contract had been signed 2 years earlier, when Isabel was barely old enough to write her own name. King Edmund of Aragon needed Navarre's military alliance. Isabel's father needed Aragon's gold. Nobody asked Isabel what she needed. On the morning of the ceremony, older women from Edmund's court came to prepare her. They stripped her, bathed her in rosewater, and dressed her like a doll. One of them, a duchess whose name Isabel never learned, leaned close while braiding her hair and whispered warnings that made no sense to a 12-year-old girl. "Bite down on this cloth when it hurts," the woman said, pressing a small bundle of linen into Isabel's palm. "And pray it ends quickly." Isabel stood before the mirror and didn't recognize herself. The girl looking back was a painted ghost, chalk-white powder covering her naturally olive skin, rouge on her cheeks making her look feverish. They had plucked her eyebrows, rubbed her lips with crushed berries until they bled naturally red. She looked like a corpse prepared for viewing. King Edmund was 53 years old. He had buried 2 wives already, both dead in childbirth. When Isabel saw him waiting at the altar, she understood for the first time that this was real. His face was mapped with broken blood vessels. His hands, when he took hers for the vows, were spotted with age and trembled slightly. He smelled of wine and something else, something rotten that she would later recognize as infected gums. The ceremony lasted 4 hours. Isabel's legs went numb from standing. Nobody offered her a chair. When Edmund finally kissed her to seal their union, his breath was so foul she gagged. The congregation applauded. Musicians played. Outside, commoners cheered for the alliance that would supposedly bring peace and prosperity. That evening, as servants prepared the royal bedchamber, Isabel's mother was allowed 5 minutes alone with her daughter. The Queen of Navarre knelt before her child, gripped her shoulders, and said nothing. She just stared at Isabel's face with an expression that looked like grief. Then attendants pulled them apart, and Isabel never saw her mother again. The bedding ceremony required witnesses. This wasn't optional. This wasn't private. 37 members of the highest nobility from both kingdoms gathered in the royal chamber to observe the consummation of this political alliance. They needed proof. They needed to ensure the marriage was legally binding. They needed to watch a 53-year-old king get into bed with a 12-year-old girl because that's how power worked in 1347. The bed itself was obscene in its luxury. Silk sheets imported from Constantinople, pillows stuffed with swan feathers, curtains of velvet dyed with crushed insects worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. All of it would be ruined by morning. But what happened in that bed, under the eyes of 36 witnesses, would do more than ruin expensive fabric. They undressed Isabel in front of everyone. Female attendants removed her wedding gown piece by piece, while male courtiers watched from their positions around the chamber. Edmund was undressed by his own servants, his pale, sagging body exposed without shame. He had done this twice before. This was routine for him. When they placed Isabel in the bed, she was shaking so violently that the mattress moved. One of the witnesses, a bishop whose job was to bless the union, later testified that the child was trembling like a rabbit before hounds. Edmund climbed in beside her, and attendants drew the bed curtains closed, leaving just enough gap for the witnesses to confirm what needed confirming. What happened next took less than 10 minutes, but would be documented in gruesome detail by multiple sources. Court physicians, religious authorities, and traumatized nobles would all provide testimonies that matched almost perfectly. Edmund was drunk. This was noted by everyone present. He had consumed significant amounts of wine during the wedding feast, supposedly to prepare himself for his husbandly duties. In his intoxicated state, he had no control, no awareness of the damage he was causing. The screaming started almost immediately, not the sounds anyone expected. These were screams of actual physical trauma. Isabel's voice, still high and childish, shrieking in genuine agony. Several female witnesses tried to intervene, but Edmund's male advisors blocked them. The marriage must be consummated, they insisted. This is normal nervousness. But the blood told a different story. It started seeping through the silk sheets within minutes. Dark red stains spreading across white fabric. Then it began dripping. Actual drops of blood falling from the bed onto the marble floor. The sound of it hitting stone was audible in the silence between Isabel's screams. A court physician named Dr. Alfonso Garcia was present as a witness. His written testimony, preserved in the Royal Archives, describes what he observed. The volume of blood was inconsistent with normal defloration. Within a quarter hour, the sheets were saturated completely. The child's screams suggested internal tearing of a severity I had only seen in battlefield injuries. The bishop tried to stop it. He actually stepped forward and demanded Edmund withdraw, citing moral authority. Edmund's advisors physically restrained the bishop. The marriage had to be completed. The alliance depended on it. 37 people stood in that room and did nothing while a 12-year-old girl bled onto marble floors. When Edmund finally finished and withdrew, he was covered in blood up to his thighs. He looked down at Isabel, registered something wrong in her stillness, and actually laughed. A drunk, nervous laugh. "She'll be fine," he told the room. "My first wife bled like a pig, too." But when attendants pulled back the bed curtains fully, even Edmund's most loyal advisors stepped backward in horror. Isabel was conscious but silent now. Her eyes were open, staring at the canopy above, unblinking. The sheets beneath her were not just stained but soaked through, blood pooling in the depression her small body made in the mattress. Her legs, her thighs, everything below her waist was dark with blood. Dr. Garcia rushed forward. His examination, conducted right there with dozens of witnesses watching, revealed catastrophic internal damage. "The child's pelvis is too narrow," he announced to the room. "This should never have been attempted." They tried to move Isabel, and that's when the real hemorrhaging began. Blood gushed, not flowed, from her body. It soaked through the hands of the women trying to help her. It spread across the floor so quickly that nobles had to step back to avoid it reaching their shoes. 3 court physicians worked on Isabel right there in the bed, in front of all the witnesses. They packed cloth between her legs, applied pressure, tried medieval cauterization techniques that made her scream again after minutes of shocked silence. Nothing worked. The bleeding slowed but never stopped. By dawn, they had changed the sheets 4 times. Each set became soaked through within an hour. Servants carried bundle after bundle of blood-drenched silk from the chamber. Some of them vomited in the hallways. One young maid quit her position entirely and entered a convent the next day. Edmund, sobered by morning, stood at the foot of the bed and watched physicians work on his dying child bride. His advisors begged him to show concern, to appear remorseful, to do something that might salvage the political situation. He refused to leave, but also refused to help. He just stood there, watching Isabel bleed, as if he couldn't quite understand how this had become his problem. But the worst part, the detail that would haunt every witness for the rest of their lives, was that Isabel remained conscious through all of it. For 3 days, she lay in that bed, bleeding slowly to death, fully aware of what was happening to her. She never cried after that first night. She never spoke. She just stared at the ceiling while her life drained away in measure increments, her 12-year-old mind trying to process a trauma that had no precedent in her short existence. And outside the chamber, political wheels kept turning, because even as Isabel died, the marriage had been consummated. The alliance was sealed. In the cold logic of medieval politics, this counted as a success. By the second day, the entire palace knew something had gone catastrophically wrong. Servants whispered in corridors. Nobles who had witnessed the bedding ceremony couldn't eat breakfast. Several had nightmares so severe they required sedation from the same physicians trying to save Isabel's life. Edmund ordered the chamber sealed. Only medical personnel and select advisors could enter. But the doors were thick wood, not stone, and Isabel's occasional screams carried through the palace hallways. When physicians applied hot irons to cauterize internal bleeding, her shrieks echoed through 3 floors. Courtiers pressed their hands over their ears and pretended not to hear. The medical treatments were worse than the injury. Medieval medicine had exactly 3 responses to hemorrhaging: bloodletting, cauterization, and prayer. Dr. Garcia tried all 3 simultaneously. They bled Isabel from her arms, believing it would rebalance her humors and slow the bleeding elsewhere. This, predictably, made everything worse. A 12-year-old body has approximately 2,000 milliliters of blood. Isabel was losing it from multiple sources now: the original trauma, the therapeutic bloodletting, and the cauterization wounds that refused to clot properly. The cauterization process involved heating iron rods until they glowed red, then pressing them against torn internal tissue. They had to go through her vaginal opening to reach the damaged areas. There was no anesthesia beyond wine and laudanum, neither of which worked adequately for this level of pain. Isabel would pass out, wake up screaming, pass out again. The smell of burning flesh filled the royal bedchamber and seeped into the corridor outside. On the morning of the 2nd day, they brought in leeches, hundreds of them. The theory was that leeches would draw out poisoned blood and promote healing. They attached the creatures to Isabel's inner thighs, her abdomen, anywhere near the injury site. The leeches gorged themselves and fell off, bloated and dark. Servants collected them in buckets. The treatment accomplished nothing except adding another layer of horror to an already nightmarish situation. Edmund visited the chamber twice daily, stayed for exactly 5 minutes each time, and left without speaking to Isabel directly. He addressed questions to Dr. Garcia as if his wife wasn't conscious and listening. "Will she survive?" he asked on the 2nd afternoon. Garcia, exhausted and covered in blood from another failed cauterization attempt, gave him a look of pure contempt before answering. "The child has lost more blood than most soldiers lose in battle. If she survives, it will be despite our efforts, not because of them." The religious response was equally useless. The bishop, who had tried to stop the consummation, now led prayer vigils outside the chamber. Priests performed hourly blessings. They brought holy relics to place on Isabel's chest: fragments of saints' bones, pieces of the true cross, vials of holy water from Jerusalem. They sprinkled her with blessed salt, made her drink wine that had been prayed over. None of it stopped the bleeding. What the priests didn't do was criticize Edmund, not publicly, because criticizing a king's sexual conduct, even when that conduct had destroyed a child, was dangerous. So they prayed for God's will to be done, and privately questioned what kind of God would will this. Isabel's mother, Queen Marie of Navarre, was 200 miles away and had no idea her daughter was dying. Communication traveled slowly in 1347. Messengers on horseback took 3 days minimum to cross the distance between kingdoms. Edmund's advisors debated whether to send word at all. If Isabel died, notifying her family might trigger a diplomatic incident. If she lived, notifying them of the trauma might still trigger a diplomatic incident. They decided to wait. On the 3rd morning, palace servants were ordered to change the blood-soaked sheets one final time. They needed 6 people to lift Isabel carefully enough to slide clean fabric underneath her without restarting major bleeding. The sheets they removed weighed twice what they should have, saturated completely with blood and other fluids. One of the serving girls, a 15-year-old named Elena, later testified about that moment. The princess looked like a wax figure. Her skin was white as candle tallow. Her lips had no color. But her eyes were open, and she was watching us work. She was aware of everything. That was the worst part. She knew she was dying, and she was only 12 years old. The smell in the chamber had become unbearable by day 3. Blood has a distinctive odor when it sits too long, especially in a warm room. Combined with the smell of burned flesh from the cauterizations, infected tissue beginning to rot, and the general stench of medieval medical procedures, the royal bedchamber smelled like a slaughterhouse. Courtiers began speculating about divine punishment. Surely this was God's judgment on the marriage. Some whispered that Edmund had angered heaven by forcing himself on a child. Others suggested Isabel herself was cursed, that her family had brought evil into Aragon. The superstitious talk spread through the palace like disease. Edmund's own behavior fed the rumors. He started drinking earlier each day. By the third evening, he was drunk before sunset, ranting about political enemies who had cursed his marriage bed. He accused his advisors of choosing him a defective bride. He actually used that word, defective. As if the problem was Isabel's body being inadequately constructed, not his decision to rape a 12-year-old. Meanwhile, in the sealed chamber, Dr. Garcia made a decision that would later cost him his position. He stopped the aggressive treatments. No more cauterization, no more bloodletting, no more leeches. He simply focused on keeping Isabel comfortable and clean, packing fresh cloth to absorb the ongoing bleeding, and administering enough laudanum to dull her pain without killing her outright. "There is nothing more to be done," he told the attending priests. "We can only wait to see if her body can survive what has been done to it." On the third night, when servants came to change the packing cloths between Isabel's legs, they found something that made even hardened palace workers step back in shock. The cloth they removed was not just blood-soaked. It contained pieces of tissue, fragments of internal organs that had torn away and were being expelled from her body. Dr. Garcia examined them by candlelight and recognized parts of her uterine wall. A 12-year-old girl's reproductive system had been so catastrophically damaged that it was literally falling out of her body in pieces. And she was still conscious, still aware, still trapped in a nightmare from which there was no waking. Princess Isabel of Navarre died at dawn on the fourth day, with only Dr. Garcia and 2 nuns present. Edmund was not there. He had stayed up drinking the previous night and was unconscious in his own chambers when his child bride finally stopped breathing. The manner of her death was documented precisely because Dr. Garcia knew what was coming. He understood that this death would have political consequences that extended far beyond one tragic wedding night. So he recorded everything. Isabel's final hours were marked by a phenomena that terrified the attending nuns. She became lucid. The laudanum fog lifted, and for the first time in 3 days, she spoke. Her voice was weak, barely above a whisper, but her words were clear. "Tell my mother I'm sorry," she said to one of the nuns. "Not sorry for dying. Sorry for existing. Sorry for being the daughter who got sacrificed for an alliance." That was her final message to her family. Then she looked at Dr. Garcia with eyes that seemed decades older than 12 and asked a question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Will other girls die like this?" Garcia had no answer. Because the truth was, yes, absolutely. Other girls would be married off at 12 or younger, and some of them would suffer similar fates, and the political machinery would grind forward regardless. But he couldn't say that to a dying child. So he lied. "No, princess. This will never happen again." Isabel smiled slightly, a terrible knowing smile, and closed her eyes. She died 6 minutes later. The cause of death, as recorded by Dr. Garcia: catastrophic internal hemorrhaging secondary to violent sexual trauma, inflicted upon a physically immature body. When servants came to prepare Isabel's body for viewing, they discovered the full extent of the damage. Her entire lower body was discolored from internal bleeding. The blood that had soaked through sheets and dripped onto marble floors was only a fraction of what she had lost internally. Her abdomen was distended from blood pooling in her peritoneal cavity. When they tried to dress her in burial clothes, blood and fluid leaked from her body, staining the white burial gown immediately. Edmund was informed of his wife's death at noon. His first response was not grief or remorse. His first question was the marriage consummated before she died? His advisors confirmed that yes, witnesses had testified, the marriage was legally valid. Edmund actually looked relieved. His second question: how do we manage the political situation? Because that's what Isabel's death had become. A political situation. Not a tragedy, not a preventable horror. Just another diplomatic problem requiring careful management. But Edmund's advisors had severely miscalculated the reaction from Navarre. Word of Isabel's death reached her father, King Philip of Navarre, 5 days later. The messenger carried an official letter from Edmund, expressing deep sorrow over the unfortunate loss of his young bride. The letter made no mention of how she died. It suggested she had succumbed to illness following the wedding festivities. King Philip was not an idiot. He demanded details. He sent his own physicians to Aragon to examine Isabel's body and interview witnesses. Edmund tried to refuse, claiming it would be disrespectful to the deceased. Philip threatened war. Edmund relented. What Philip's investigators discovered ignited a diplomatic firestorm that would consume both kingdoms. Dr. Garcia, no longer employed by Edmund's court after being dismissed for defeatist medical practices, gave testimony that spared no details. The 37 noble witnesses to the bedding ceremony were interviewed separately. Their accounts matched perfectly. The bishop who had tried to stop the consummation provided a written statement that became a damning indictment. I witnessed the deliberate destruction of a child's body for political purposes. Those present, including myself to my eternal shame, valued alliance over human life. May God forgive us, for I cannot forgive myself. When Philip received these testimonies, he did something unprecedented. He published them, not just to other royal courts, but to the broader nobility and eventually to anyone who could read. Copies of Dr. Garcia's medical report, witness testimonies, and the bishop's statement circulated throughout Europe. Medieval society had seen plenty of young marriages and plenty of deaths, but the explicit details of Isabel's suffering, documented by multiple credible sources, created a scandal unlike anything the continent had experienced. This wasn't rumor or gossip. This was documented, witnessed, undeniable evidence of a child's brutal death. Edmund's reputation collapsed overnight. Allied kingdoms distanced themselves. Pope Clement VI, facing pressure from Philip and other monarchs, issued a rare public rebuke of Edmund's conduct. The Church couldn't annul a marriage that had ended in death, but they could and did condemn the circumstances surrounding it. Philip of Navarre formally declared war on Aragon 3 weeks after his daughter's death. But this wasn't a typical medieval conflict over territory or succession. Philip's stated war aim was personal, the complete destruction of Edmund's rule. Philip had the moral high ground, documented evidence of his daughter's murder, and the sympathy of most of Europe. Edmund had a depleted treasury, wavering allies, and the stain of child-killing on his crown. The war lasted 18 months and devastated both kingdoms. But more devastating than any battle was what happened inside Aragon itself. Edmund's own nobles began to turn against him, not because they were morally outraged by Isabel's death, but because Edmund's crime had become publicly indefensible. Supporting him meant sharing his shame. 3 of Edmund's highest-ranking advisors, who had prevented the bishop from stopping the consummation, faced their own reckoning. 2 were assassinated, probably by their own family members trying to distance themselves from the scandal. The 3rd committed suicide after being excommunicated by the Church. But the true destruction of Edmund's throne was still to come. Because when Philip's investigators had examined Isabel's body, they had discovered something that would make an already horrific situation infinitely worse. King Philip of Navarre violated every religious and social custom of medieval Europe when he demanded a full autopsy of his daughter's body. The Church forbade such examinations. Medieval belief held that the body must remain intact for resurrection. Cutting open a corpse was considered desecration, potential damnation for everyone involved. Philip didn't care. He wanted the world to see exactly what had been done to Isabel. He brought in Dr. Tomás Rodriguez, the most respected physician in Navarre, and 2 surgeons from the University of Montpellier. He provided them with legal protection, promised them the Church's forgiveness that he had no authority to grant, and ordered them to document everything they found inside his 12-year-old daughter's body. The examination took place in a chapel that had been converted into a makeshift surgical theater. Witnesses included Philip himself, 3 bishops who agreed to observe despite Church prohibition, Dr. Garcia, who had treated Isabel during her final days, and a legal notary whose job was to record every finding in writing. What they discovered inside Isabel's body was worse than anyone had imagined. Dr. Rodriguez began his official report with a description that made several witnesses vomit. The subject presents with extensive post-mortem discoloration of the lower abdomen and pelvic region, indicating massive internal hemorrhaging that occurred prior to death. When they opened her abdominal cavity, they found it filled with blood. Not the small amounts expected from the documented external bleeding, but nearly a liter of blood that had pooled internally. Her peritoneal cavity had essentially become a reservoir of her own blood, slowly leaking from catastrophic internal injuries. The damage to Isabel's reproductive system was so severe that Dr. Rodriguez initially had difficulty identifying anatomical structures. Her vaginal canal had been torn completely through in multiple places. The tears extended up into her cervix and lower uterine wall. One tear was so deep it had perforated into her bladder, creating an abnormal opening between her urinary and reproductive tracts. But the worst discovery was what the physicians found when they examined her pelvic bones. Isabel's pelvis had fractured. The force of Edmund's assault had literally broken the child's hip bones. Hairline fractures radiated from her pubic symphysis, the cartilage joint at the front of the pelvis. These fractures had created internal bleeding that never stopped, slowly filling her abdominal cavity, while physicians focused on the external wounds. Dr. Rodriguez's hands shook as he dictated his findings to the notary. These injuries are consistent with violent force applied to a structurally immature pelvis. The subject's bones had not yet fused to adult density. The trauma was sufficient to cause catastrophic structural failure. In simpler terms, Edmund had broken his child bride's body by forcing it to do something it was physically incapable of surviving. The examination of Isabel's uterus revealed something that made King Philip leave the room. Her uterine lining was not just damaged, but partially detached, hanging in strips inside the organ. This was why servants had found tissue fragments in the cloths they used to pack her wounds. Isabel had been slowly expelling pieces of her own reproductive system for 3 days before she died. Dr. Rodriguez made a measurement that became one of the most damning pieces of evidence. Isabel's pelvic opening measured 8.4 centimeters at its widest point. An adult woman's pelvis measures approximately 11 to 13 centimeters. Isabel's body was literally too small for adult sexual intercourse. The act itself was, by physical reality, an act of destruction. One of the surgeons from Montpellier added his own observation to the record. I have examined battlefield casualties with less severe internal trauma than what I observe in this child's body. These injuries required sustained violent force over several minutes. This was not an accident or a moment of carelessness. This was prolonged brutality. The autopsy also revealed evidence that contradicted Edmund's later claims of having been gentle and careful with his young bride. Isabel had defensive bruising on her inner thighs, marks where someone had forcibly held her legs apart. She had bruises on her upper arms, consistent with being held down. She had a small fracture in one rib that physicians believed came from being pressed into the mattress with too much weight. Every injury told the same story. A small child had fought, had tried to escape, and had been physically overpowered by an adult man who outweighed her by at least 150 pounds. The autopsy report ran to 14 pages of detailed Latin medical terminology and precise anatomical descriptions. Dr. Rodriguez concluded with a statement that destroyed any remaining defense Edmund might have offered. It is the professional opinion of this examiner that the subject's injuries were incompatible with survival from the moment they were inflicted. No medical intervention known to contemporary science could have prevented the outcome. The subject was, in effect, dead from the first moments of her marriage. King Philip had the report translated into 6 languages. He sent copies to every royal court in Europe, to the Pope, to university medical schools, to bishops and archbishops across the continent. He wanted everyone to know exactly how his daughter had died. The document sparked outrage that transcended typical medieval attitudes about marriage and children. Even in an era that accepted young marriages and female subservience, the explicit medical evidence of a child's destruction proved too much. This wasn't about politics or alliance anymore. This was about something that violated basic human instinct. Edmund tried to suppress the report. offering bribes to officials, threatening anyone who circulated it, even attempting to have Philip charged with heresy for authorizing the autopsy. Nothing worked. The truth was out, documented by respected physicians, witnessed by religious authorities, impossible to deny or minimize. The Pope himself read the autopsy report. Clement VI, who had seen every form of medieval cruelty during his papacy, was reportedly disturbed enough to demand a full investigation. While he couldn't annul a marriage that had ended in death, he could and did issue a formal condemnation of Edmund's conduct. More significantly, the Pope quietly instructed bishops across Europe to begin refusing approval for marriages involving girls under 14. It wasn't an official decree, wasn't a change in church law, but it was a direct response to Isabel's death. One child's brutal autopsy had influenced papal policy. But Edmund's destruction was far from over. The autopsy report had revealed the physical truth of what happened in that bedchamber. What happened next would reveal the political and dynastic consequences of one night's brutality. King Edmund of Aragon lived for 5 more years after Isabel's death. They were the worst years of his life, and they destroyed everything he had spent decades building. The war with Navarre ended after 18 months, not with a clear victory, but with Edmund's treasury depleted and his army exhausted. Philip of Navarre had achieved his real goal, making Edmund's name synonymous with child murder across Europe. Edmund signed a humiliating peace treaty that required him to pay substantial reparations to Navarre and publicly acknowledge his tragic error in judgment. But the military defeat was nothing compared to what happened inside Aragon itself. Edmund's own children from his first 2 marriages turned against him. His eldest son, Crown Prince Alfonso, publicly denounced his father's actions in a letter to the Pope. Alfonso didn't do this out of moral righteousness. He did it because associating with Edmund had become politically toxic, and Alfonso wanted to ensure his own future reign wouldn't be tainted by his father's crimes. 2 of Edmund's daughters entered convents rather than remain at their father's court. One later wrote in her personal journal, preserved in monastery archives, "I cannot bear to look at my father without seeing the blood of an innocent child on his hands. Better to live as a bride of Christ than remain in the house of a murderer." Edmund's nobles abandoned him in cascading waves. First the lower nobility, then the barons, finally even his closest advisors. They didn't revolt or rebel. They simply stopped showing up. Court functions became embarrassingly empty. When Edmund held audiences, half the seats remained vacant. He became a king ruling an increasingly hollow throne. The international isolation was absolute. No foreign monarch would negotiate with Edmund directly. No royal family would consider marriage alliances with Aragon. Edmund had become a diplomatic pariah, his kingdom frozen out of European politics for as long as he remained king. The psychological toll destroyed what was left of Edmund's mind. He began drinking constantly, starting before dawn and continuing until he passed out each night. Palace servants reported that he would wake screaming, claiming to see blood on his hands that wouldn't wash off. He became paranoid, convinced that Isabel's ghost haunted his chambers. He ordered the royal bedchamber where she died sealed permanently, but insisted he could still hear her screams through the walls. His paranoia extended to everyone around him. He accused servants of poisoning his food. He had guards arrested for supposedly plotting against him. He executed 3 of his own advisors on fabricated charges of treason, which only accelerated the exodus of anyone with sense enough to flee. By 1351, 4 years after Isabel's death, Edmund was essentially a prisoner in his own palace. He rarely left his private chambers. He saw almost no one except the handful of servants too loyal or too frightened to abandon their posts. The business of governing Aragon fell to Prince Alfonso, who ruled in everything but name while his father deteriorated. Edmund's health collapsed along with his mind. The years of heavy drinking destroyed his liver. He developed jaundice, his skin turning yellow. He suffered from what physicians called brain fever, probably hepatic encephalopathy caused by liver failure. His hands trembled constantly. He lost weight dramatically, his body consuming itself. In his final year, Edmund became obsessed with religious redemption. He confessed his sins repeatedly to priests, begging for assurance of salvation. He donated vast sums to the church, trying to buy his way into heaven. He commissioned prayers for Isabel's soul, as if acknowledging her in death could somehow compensate for destroying her in life. None of it helped. The church accepted his money but offered no forgiveness. Priests who heard his confessions emerged from his chambers, looking disturbed, refusing to discuss what Edmund had told them. Whatever specific details Edmund revealed in confession stayed secret, but the priest's reactions told observers everything they needed to know. King Edmund of Aragon died on March 3, 1352, at age 58. He was found in his bed by a servant who had come to bring his morning meal. Edmund had been dead for several hours. His eyes were open. His face was twisted in an expression that the servant described as absolute terror. The official cause of death was listed as complications from prolonged illness. The actual cause was liver failure secondary to alcoholism, brought on by 5 years of trying to drink himself into oblivion to escape the memory of what he had done. But Edmund's death solved nothing for Aragon. His son Alfonso inherited a kingdom that had been internationally isolated, financially depleted, and morally compromised. The association with Edmund's crime clung to the Aragonese royal line like a stain that wouldn't wash out. Alfonso tried desperately to rehabilitate his family's reputation. He commissioned churches, funded charitable works, sent envoys across Europe promising that Aragon under his rule would be different. It didn't work. The memory of Isabel's death was too recent, too well documented, too horrific to forget. Foreign kingdoms still refused marriage alliances with Aragon. Noble families within Aragon began marrying their children to foreign royalty instead of strengthening ties to Alfonso's court. The kingdom's political isolation continued for an entire generation. The consequences extended beyond politics. Aragon's economy suffered because international trade relationships had been damaged. The kingdom's military strength declined because allied nations refused joint operations. Aragon, which had been a rising power in 1347, became a second-tier kingdom struggling to maintain relevance. The dynastic consequences were even more severe. Alfonso managed only 2 children before his wife died in childbirth. His son produced no male heirs. By 1410, less than 60 years after Edmund's death, the direct male line of Aragonese succession had failed completely. The throne passed to a distant cousin from Castile, effectively ending the dynasty that Edmund had destroyed with one night of brutality. Historians argue about whether Isabel's death directly caused the dynastic collapse or merely accelerated existing problems. But the timeline is striking. A kingdom that seemed stable in 1347 had lost its royal line by 1410. 3 generations failed to recover from one night's horror. The story didn't end with political collapse. Isabel's death became a reference point in medieval medical texts. Physicians across Europe began citing her case as evidence that child marriages could be physically dangerous, not just morally questionable. Medical schools used Dr. Rodriguez's autopsy report as a teaching tool about developmental anatomy and trauma. The Church, despite never officially changing canon law, quietly discouraged extremely young marriages after Isabel's death. Bishops had new grounds for refusing to sanctify unions involving girls under 14. The girl whose body was destroyed in pursuit of political alliance became the unintended catalyst for marginal but real protections for other girls. But perhaps the most enduring consequence was simpler and more personal. For decades after Isabel's death, when European nobles arranged marriages for their daughters, mothers would whisper the story of the Princess of Navarre who bled to death on her wedding night. It became a cautionary tale, a nightmare scenario, a reminder that political ambition could destroy the children caught in its machinery. King Edmund of Aragon thought he was securing an alliance when he married Isabel of Navarre. Instead, he married a 12-year-old child whose body couldn't survive what he did to it. Her death didn't just end one life. It destroyed a king's reputation, isolated a kingdom, collapsed a dynasty, and changed how an entire continent thought about the price of political marriages. Edmund spent 5 years trying to escape the consequences of one night's brutality. He died having failed completely, leaving a kingdom that would never fully recover. And all because he couldn't see that the small child in white silk was a human being, not a political tool. By the time he understood that truth, Isabel was dead, and his own destruction was inevitable. The throne didn't fall to an invasion or a rebellion. It fell to the weight of one child's blood, spilled for an alliance that died with her.